Hello and welcome to CIS-211 Web Server Administration, a 2-credit course at Henry Ford College. My name is Micah Webner. I have been an IT professional for over 30 years and have been building websites on Linux servers for over 25 years. In this introduction, I'm going to go over the basics of the information that is covered in the CIS-211 class. So what is a web server exactly? A web server is a system that's connected to the internet or a local network. It has known locations. You can find it through DNS, through a hosts file, or through an IP address directly, as long as you know the IP address. A web server supports the HTTP protocol, which is something we're going to cover in this class. And it is a server that can access and deliver information. That's really the very basic definition of a web server. Anything that can do that does qualify as a web server, no matter how basic. It can be just a very small appliance. It could be a giant room full of servers in a cluster. Some of the advanced features of a web server are that they can support dynamic content, can access databases, that they can host multimedia, they can store session information with cookies, they can do distributed authoring and versioning with WebDAV. Most web servers provide some layer of security, and advanced web servers are scalable and fault tolerant so that if one server in the cluster fails, it can fail over and another server will continue to run. Web servers can run on a variety of platforms. Primarily, they run on Linux or Windows. And this course focuses on Linux web servers. When choosing an operating system for a web server, use the best choice for your project and the developer tools that are being used. If you are supporting a primarily Windows-based application system and you're building a web interface for that system, then Windows and IIS and SQL Server are going to be better choices for you. In many cases, however, Linux is going to be the best option. Sometimes the equipment available to you is going to help you decide what type of web server to run. Whether your server is on premises or hosted might be a factor. And sometimes you're just going to have a job where you're not going to get to choose what web server you're going to use. Simplest case would be that your employer has already decided the platform and you don't really have any say in the matter at all, so you just have to use what it is. Now, what about macOS? macOS can also be a server, and there's a couple of different ways to do it. A macOS server is a $20 add-on product that has 1-star reviews. And for very simple web servers on macOS, like for local development, you don't really need that package. There are still companies out there like MacStadium that provide co-location hosting. And there are local development platforms like MAMP and Docker that run on macOS and Windows, and those mimic Linux platforms in the way they set up systems. In fact, the web server that comes with MAMP that you would set up is actually very, very similar to what you're going to learn in this class as far as how it works, how it can be manipulated, and if you dig down into the configuration files, how it can be tweaked to work the way you want it to work. On Windows, the primary web server is Internet Information Server. IIS combines with Microsoft SQL Server and .NET applications, and that's where a lot of your enterprise web-based software comes from. Again, it's a SQL Server and .NET environment. All that development has been done that way, so you would run your web server on that because it's going to integrate with that. You're going to run your web server on Windows and IIS because it's going to integrate well with the rest of your application stack. IIS provides privileged mode architecture and fault tolerance capacity. It's very robust support for both large and small databases. It does have versatile database support through IIS ODBC, so you can talk to a variety of backend databases. SQL Server is not your only option there. And one of the benefits of IIS is that it supports Active Directory authentication and other Microsoft Network security features and tools, so you can have a website that has seamless login with your Active Directory network if you're working in an organization that has a full-on Windows-based security structure. Now, aside from SQL Server, which is very big and very expensive, SQL Server Express Edition is a free entry-level version of Microsoft SQL Server. It's easy to install. It supports small databases up to 10 gigabytes, which actually is a pretty good sized database for most applications other than enterprise software. So that's a free way that you can get your database running on a Windows server. This course is going to focus primarily on the LAMP stack, typically known for Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. However, the M could be MariaDB instead of MySQL. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And the P could be Perl or Python. It doesn't necessarily have to be PHP. You may also run into the phrase a LEMP stack, and LEMP uses nginx for the web server instead of Apache. The core piece of the LAMP stack is the Apache HTTPD server, also known as the Apache 2 Web Server. It's maintained and supported by the Apache Software Foundation. Apache is the most common used web server on Linux platform. It's considered to be Apache, air quotes, version of the NCSA HTTPD server, but that's not really the origin of the name. nginx is a relative newcomer to the web server platform environment. It is small, quick, it's focused on high performance, load balancing, and proxy. It's lightweight and relatively easy to configure. There are open source and commercial versions available. One of the features of Apache is that it has lots and lots of modules available to it. And you can compile a whole lot of functionality into the Apache web server. Usually those modules are loaded as libraries as needed on demand. And so the Apache web server has a lot of functionality, a lot of different things it can support. It can support languages like Perl and PHP directly through modules running as part of the Apache server. This makes it very big, very powerful, and very popular, but it also has, in recent years, made it a little bit slower. nginx is much more stripped down, and with nginx, it basically doesn't do anything. It doesn't have really any language support for dynamic languages. Instead, it expects your language processor to have its own listener, and it will basically pass web requests to those language processors by acting as a proxy. So for example, if you have a PHP website and you're running nginx, nginx will serve all of your images and CSS files and all of those assets, but it passes PHP functions off to another process, a different PHP listener that runs PHP. I said earlier that MAMP is very similar to the LAMP stack. Docker, on the other hand, typically you would build, especially for a PHP platform, you would build that with an nginx server in front of your PHP processes and your database container. MySQL was the database of choice on Linux platforms and is part of the LAMP stack for many, many years. At some point, Oracle Corporation acquired the rights to MySQL, and they pretty much control it now. In 2012, the original founders of MySQL created a fork called MariaDB, and that is now the open source and completely free version of what used to be MySQL. Features and language-wise, they're completely 100% compatible with MySQL. MariaDB is now the default database in most Linux distributions. And one of the trade-offs there, it depends on your environment again and your needs. MariaDB is developed and supported by the community as open source, but Oracle offers paid support for MySQL. So if you're working for a company that's getting paid support for, say, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and they also want to pay for support for the databases, then you're probably going to stick with MySQL and Oracle in that case. MariaDB now does have enterprise pricing and support, so that may be another reason to just go ahead and stick with MariaDB these days if you're building a new web server. While MySQL and MariaDB have been around and kind of been the standard for a long time, that standard is starting to shift with some platforms, and you're starting to find that more frameworks and more tools default to preferring PostgreSQL as their database of choice. It is also very mature, very stable. It is an alternative to MySQL and MariaDB. And PostgreSQL is now the preferred or required database for some open source projects or community projects, including GitLab and Symfony. Most of the proponents of PostgreSQL argue that it performs better under high load and it is less prone to data corruption. Another alternative when building a small website is to just use the SQLite libraries and implement your database that way. SQLite or SQLite, I've heard it pronounced both ways, is easy to implement. It's just a lightweight library, so it's just as far as the driver, you don't need a full separate database server running. With this, all you need is a library that's part of your language code, your PHP or other language code. It stores your data in a single database file. It is, for the most part, MySQL compatible in its language. It's not intended for heavy load, but if you're making a small site, a low traffic site, SQLite might actually be the way to go to create and maintain the database for that project. It's also possible, again, to set up a development environment where you're using SQLite as your development database, but then you may be using MariaDB or another database engine as your production database. And of course, that brings us to the last part of our LAMP stack, PHP, the PHP Hypertext Processor. Originally known as the personal homepage, its name is now a recursive acronym. One of the advantages of PHP is that PHP markup can actually be embedded in HTML files, and the PHP processor can read through those HTML files, ignore the HTML part during processing, just read the code that's in between the PHP tags, and then render out an HTML file to the web server and send it out to the browser as a fully rendered HTML page. There are some other embedded language examples like this. Microsoft's Classic ASP works this way, and Java JSP also works this way. They are all examples of systems that will parse the HTML with the embedded code in it, run the code, and then generate a page that contains all of it. You may have heard rumors that PHP is dead, and I'm here to tell you that PHP is not dead. As of March 2022, PHP powers 77.8% of the websites whose languages can be identified, including Facebook, Wikipedia, QQ.com, VK.com, and WordPress.com. I've got a chart here, and you can see that PHP is used by many sites, but primarily the mid-sized sites. Some of the huge sites that are maybe not as many sites, but they're much more high traffic, high volume sites. You'll see Java, you'll see ASP.NET, you'll even see some Ruby sites that are still out there. But PHP is kind of the king of the mid-sized site world. As far as, again, with 77.8% of the market share, PHP is definitely not dead. So why do people say it's dead? Well, let's look at a quick history of PHP. PHP 3 and PHP 4 were relatively weak. They had lots of security holes. It was really easy to write just absolutely terrible applications with them, and they were very, very insecure. So that is the source of the dead language rumors. And people have been talking since PHP 4 was the primary version of PHP out there that PHP is dead and it was soon to be replaced and no one's ever going to use PHP in the future. Don't learn it. Well, PHP 5 was released in 2004, and PHP 5 fixed most of those problems. It added object-oriented programming, it added better security, it fixed many, if not all, of the bugs in PHP 3 and 4, and PHP 5 really became a stable platform starting around 2004. PHP 5 had a number of releases from 5.0 to 5.6, and during that time, the PHP community did start working on PHP 6. However, that kind of stalled out while PHP continued to advance. So most of the work that did go into PHP 6 was just rolled into PHP 5.3, and then PHP 5 continued for a few years. But that was enough that they went ahead and skipped a version number, and PHP 7 was released in 2015. PHP 7 worked its way up to PHP 7.4, and 7.4 will reach its end of life in November of 2022. Kind of important to mention something about end of life here. A lot of PHP versions continue on past their end of life because software distributions, Linux distributions, I should say, will ship with a certain version of PHP, and they will continue to support it even past end of life for the version that they ship with. So whenever new security releases come out for current versions of PHP, the maintainers of those Linux distributions will take those patches for security, backport them into the older versions of PHP 5 that were shipped with their systems, and continue to support that for a long time. PHP 8 was released in November 2020, and 8.1 was released just a year later in November 2021. But at the time of this recording in March of 2022, you're still going to find a lot of web servers out there running PHP 7. Most of the PHP 5 servers are gone now, but there are still a few out there. And those will be supported through distributions like Red Hat Enterprise 7 for another couple of years still until 2024. But you'll find that PHP 7 is still the vast majority of websites out there. Part of the problem is the slowness of both Linux distributions and web hosting companies to update the version of PHP they ship with. Part of it is also the software. A lot of software platforms are slow to adopt the changes in PHP versions, and so we're really just now hitting the point where even as late as January and February of 2022, we're finding that the more modern software platforms are all requiring PHP 8.0.2, but they don't all have support for PHP 8.1 yet, even the more cutting edge ones. So when setting up a web server and when choosing what you should put on your web server, you need to look at the software and the software requirements very closely to make sure you're installing the right version of PHP for your application. Now, I've already mentioned local development a couple of times. When you install software for local development on your desktop or laptop machine, you're still installing a web server. Pretty much the same thing we're going to be doing on a Linux server in this class. Installing MAMP, WAMP, or XAMPP. Homebrew on Mac is another way to do it. On Windows, you could install the Ubuntu subsystem, and you could install Docker or Vagrant, or even if you just simply download PHP 5.4 or later, download it as a zip file, unzip it on your machine, and then from the command line, you can run it, and it will run as an internal web server. You don't need any other software to run a web server in a PHP application. It does only support one connection. It's really slow. It's really clunky, but it is a very, very simple way to set up to do local development. And as I mentioned before, if you enable the SQLite libraries, you wouldn't even need a database server, and you could start doing that kind of development with a very rudimentary development server on your local environment. My personal recommendation, again, as of March 2022, is MAMP, but I am rapidly moving most of my development to Docker. It takes a little bit of work to set it up so that you can just download your application or copy of your application onto your computer and go. But once you get everything figured out for your Docker configuration, then actually getting it to install and run on a computer is very, very simple and very, very quick. Whereas MAMP, to put a website on MAMP, requires a fair amount of setup on that computer. I've already mentioned Microsoft ASP.NET, which is primarily a Windows platform. It extends the .NET Developer Platform, gives you extra tools and libraries for building websites. It includes C#, F#, and Visual Basic right out of the box. It has a lot of base libraries, and it's got some tools and editors that will run on multiple platforms. So it is also a language that, even though we're not going to work with it directly in this class, definitely bears mention because it is a very widely used platform or application platform for websites. I should also mention Ruby on Rails, or it is also simply known as Rails. It was initially released in 2005, and at one point it was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and it was going to be the replacement for PHP, which was dead, as previously mentioned, back around 2005. But adoption grew for Ruby on Rails, and then it dropped off a little bit. A lot of big web services started running towards Ruby on Rails in the late 2000s, and then those servers started to crash as they got more and more users and became more and more popular. And then there was a big scramble to move back off of Rails because those websites just couldn't support the users that they had. And so scalability and performance really became concerns. In the previous slide, when we compared some of these platforms, we did see that Ruby on Rails was running some fairly large websites these days. So it's definitely still around, but it's nowhere near as popular as it was in the mid to late 2000s. Ruby on Rails runs natively on Linux and macOS, and you can run Rails on Windows Ubuntu system, which makes it not probably a great platform for Windows development. Again, if you're going to be developing on Windows, it's because your entire life and ecosystem is in Windows, and you should be using .NET for the most part. Yes, you can make other things work, but that's not where the majority of people are going to work. And then there are some tools that will make some of this platform independent. So it will run on Windows, it will run on a Mac or Linux, on all of these. .NET can run on Linux using Mono. JavaScript and Node.js, which are extremely popular and are really coming up to be, they're really starting to gain every year. I hear more and more things, and I see more and more things moving to JavaScript. Either Node.js or some of the other competing JavaScript frameworks. That's super popular, and it runs on just about every platform. Adobe Cold Fusion. Yeah, I have to admit, when I see a .cfm file, or and I could see that a site's been made in Cold Fusion, I kind of laugh these days, but it's still around, and some people are still using that. And then you can do Java websites on pretty much any operating system using Apache Tomcat, but please don't. That is a very, very painful way to do things. And so unless you actually have a good reason, and again, usually the reason is your employer and the software they've purchased, this is the platform you have to use, so this is what you have to do. I would not willingly choose Tomcat as a web server platform. I would look at doing something other than Java if I were trying to build websites. So that's my summary of what is a web server and what do web servers entail. And the rest of this course is going to go into detail and explain how web servers work, how to set them up, how to configure them, and how to install an application on them. Thanks for listening.